They were children in the most dangerous place on earth. What became of Joseph and Magda Goebbels' children in the Führerbunker during the Third Reich's final collapse? The short, confirmed answer is stark. The 6 young children who lived with their parents in the Reich Chancellery complex did not survive the final days of the regime. Beyond that central fact, the sequence of events, the precise mechanics of their deaths, and many details about how their remains were handled in the immediate aftermath remained contested or incompletely documented. This narration reconstructs what reliable testimony allows us to say, highlights where sources disagree, and flags those points that must remain indefinido until further evidence is accepted by historians. By April 1945, Berlin was a city under siege. Soviet forces had encircled the capital. Streets that had once hosted parades and propaganda now hosted firefights, rubble, and hungry civilians. Deep beneath the Reich Chancellery, in what has become known as the Führerbunker, a handful of senior Nazi officials and their closest aides lived out the regime's last days. Joseph Goebbels, as Reich Minister of Propaganda and one of Adolf Hitler's most loyal lieutenants, was among them. Alongside him was his wife Magda, herself a figure of public fascination and private controversy, and their children, who were kept in the subterranean complex even as Berlin burned above them. If you want more deep dives into WU2 history, subscribe and hit the bell. The presence of the Goebbels children in the bunker was the product of several factors that historians can reliably describe in broad outline. Goebbels occupied one of the most visible positions in the Nazi state. The fall of Berlin was also the collapse of the public world he had helped create. The bunker, as survivors and staff recorded, functioned as a place of shelter for select members of the inner circle, both political functionaries and their families. For many in that circle, remaining with the Führer or close to the center of power was an act of loyalty, fatalism, or both. The decision to keep the children near the bunker reflected those political loyalties, the collapse of normal channels for evacuation, and Magda Goebbels' own choices. Precisely which motives predominated, ideological conviction, maternal protectiveness twisted by fatalism, or the absence of viable alternatives, remain a matter of interpretation and, in some specifics, indefinido. The bunker itself was a cramped, claustrophobic environment. Contemporary descriptions and survivor testimony describe low ceilings, narrow corridors, dim artificial light, and the constant thrum of the battle outside. Space was at a premium and privacy scarce. For the children, young, accustomed to a more comfortable household life, daily existence in such conditions must have been bewildering and frightening. Bunker diaries, memoirs, and post-war interviews with staff members paint a picture of attempts to maintain routines where possible. Meals, supervised play, and the presence of caregivers drawn from the Chancellery staff. Several witnesses recall that Magda Goebbels remained closely involved in the children's care, and that some staff members and household aides continued to serve in a domestic capacity, even as the political situation collapsed. Still, all accounts stress the unnaturalness of raising children in a military bunker amid bombardment and the daily knowledge that the war was lost. What happened in the bunker during the last 24 hours of the Third Reich is one of the better documented sequences of the collapse, but those documents sometimes contradict and rarely offer full clarity on the fate of children. The sequence agreed on by most historians begins with Adolf Hitler's suicide on April 30, 1945, and continues with Joseph Goebbels' decision, within hours, to remain at his post and accompany his wife in the apparent choice to end their lives rather than be captured. Eyewitnesses in the bunker, including several aides and secretaries who later gave testimony, recount preparations and farewells. It is in this charged atmosphere that the question of the children's fate must be placed. Multiple well-known bunker witnesses reported that Magda Goebbels took active steps to ensure that her children would not be left to what she and her husband perceived as the humiliation or dangers of life in occupied Germany. Testimony from people who were in or around the bunker, collected in memoirs and post-war interviews, indicates that the children received sedatives or sleeping medicine on Magda's instruction. The best-known accounts come from those who served as secretaries, telephone operators, and personal aides in the bunker. These witnesses recall seeing the children in the hours after Hitler's death. They remember Magda receiving or administering something that made the children sleep, Beyond that, however, accounts diverge. A consensus among many historians is that the children were killed in the final hours of the regime, and that poison played a role. How that poison was delivered, exactly who administered it, and where in the Chancellery complex it occurred are areas where documentary gaps and conflicting memories produce ambiguity. Some survivors insist that Magda herself took the decisive steps. Others recount the involvement of household staff or medical personnel attached to the bunker. In some versions, a nurse or a doctor supplied the fatal substance and administered it at Magda's behest. In others, Magda personally gave it to her children. Because contemporaneous written records about these actions are sparse, understandably, given the chaos and the desire of participants to hide or rationalize their actions, historians must weigh witness testimony against each other. Where accounts are irreconcilable, we must mark the question of precise agency as indefinido. One anchor for historical reconstruction is the testimony of those who worked in the bunker and later spoke on the record. Secretaries recorded conversations and impressions. Raucous Misch, who served as telephone operator and bodyguard in the bunker, provided interviews describing the atmosphere and events as he remembered them. Traudl Junge, Hitler's youngest secretary, likewise provided a memoir and interviews that contributed crucial details about who was where and when in the last days. Their recollections, while invaluable, are not always identical, and memory, especially memory of traumatic, chaotic events, can be unreliable in particulars. Nonetheless, these first-person accounts consistently report that the children were presented as having been put to sleep and that their deaths occurred in close temporal proximity to the parents' suicides. Beyond survivor testimony, Allied and Soviet reports provide some corroboration of the fact that the children's bodies were found by occupying troops in the Chancellery area. Soviet accounts indicate that bodies associated with the bunker occupants were discovered, and post-war interrogations and reports documented the deaths of Goebbels and members of his household. But the precise chain of custody, who found which body, where they were interred, what, if any, formal identification was made in the immediate hours, is clouded by wartime destruction, the chaotic conditions of the fall of Berlin, and the political opacity of early Soviet reporting. The question of how the remains were handled shortly after discovery is therefore also subject to dispute, and should be treated as partly indefinido in detailed aspects. To assemble a plausible timeline from the synthesis of available testimony, on April 30th, Hitler committed suicide. On the night of April 30th, May 1st, Joseph and Magda Goebbels made final decisions about themselves and their household. The children, already living with their parents in the Chancellery complex, were put into a state of deep sedation or unconsciousness. Shortly thereafter, over the course of the night and into the morning of May 1st, the children died, by poison, in most accounts, and the parents left the bunker to take their own lives in the Chancellery garden or a nearby courtyard. In the following hours, bodies associated with the bunker occupants were discovered by Soviet troops. Exactly how many were counted and where each body was first located vary between reports. Many historians accept this broad chronology, while preserving caution about certain finer points. Several specific areas of debate deserve close attention because they illustrate the limits and strengths of our evidence. First, who administered the poison? Some witness statements attribute the direct administration to Magda Goebbels. Others place a nurse or a doctor in the role of administering the substance, either at Magda's explicit request or under a shared understanding. The difference matters not only for assigning moral responsibility, but also for understanding the dynamics of authority and complicity inside the bunker. Second, the exact substance used. Most historians accept that cyanide was the agent used in the suicide of Joseph and Magda Goebbels. For the children, accounts alternately describe sedatives followed by cyanide or other fast-acting poisons. Chemical testing was not systematically reported in the immediate Soviet documentation that has been made available, leaving room for indefinido about precise pharmacology in the children's deaths. Third, the location of the children's deaths. Some accounts place the acts within the Chancellery interior. Others place them in a room adjacent to the bunker. These spatial discrepancies arise from the complex multi-level structure of the Chancellery and the bunker beneath it, and from the different vantage points of witnesses. The immediate aftermath, how the bodies were handled, again reveals contested evidence. Soviet soldiers and later Soviet reports documented the discovery of the Goebbels bodies together with others from the bunker. Subsequent Soviet handling of these remains is notoriously opaque. Photographs, interrogation reports, and later Soviet-era publications present versions of events that do not always align neatly with Western reconstructions. What is clear is that the bodies associated with the core group in the Chancellery area did not receive a dignified public burial. Instead, in the confusion and with a view toward preventing any site of Nazi pilgrimage, occupying forces or local authorities took measures to prevent the creation of a shrine. The precise sequence, who moved bodies, where they were interred or cremated, and whether identification protocols were fully observed for each child, is an area where historians separately weigh sparse documentary traces against survivor testimony and must leave parts marked indefinido. One unavoidable question is why this set of deaths commands such moral and historiographical attention. Part of the answer lies in the moral dissonance they present. Children, vulnerable and dependent, killed in service of a political ideology that had already wrought unprecedented devastation. Historians and ethicists have debated how to describe Magda Goebbels' motives. Some interpret her actions as the product of fanatical ideological devotion. Others emphasize the distorted logic of maternal protection as she construed it, preferring death to life under occupation, under humiliation, or under a social order she considered decadent or corrupt. Scholars also point to the performative dimension of Nazi leadership in extremis. The leaders who remained in the bunker may have sought to stage a kind of consummate loyalty, and the killing of the children, or decisions about their fate, took on a ritualized, symbolic quality that multiplied the ethical horror. Legally, the children were not subjects of post-war trials or denazification processes because they were deceased. The legal reckoning that followed the Third Reich focused on surviving perpetrators, collaborators, and institutions. The immediate human consequence for surviving relatives, most notably the family members not present in the bunker, was social and legal entanglement with the regime's legacy. Magda Goebbels' son from an earlier marriage, Harold Quandt, survived the war. He was not Joseph Goebbels' son, but Magda's child by industrialist Günther Quandt, and his later life fed into debates about how German society reckoned with families who had benefited from or been associated with the Nazi order. That distinction between the Goebbels children who died in 1945 and other relatives who survived matters in historical memory because it complicates the easy narrative that all family members shared identical fates or culpability. In the decades after 1945, the story of the Goebbels children surfaced in memoirs, biographies, and documentaries, but with varying emphases and sensitivities. Survivor accounts like those of Traudl Junge, Rochus Misch, and others remain primary sources for the immediate bunker chronology. Historians compiling this material have been careful to separate what witnesses consistently report from what they later inferred or rationalized. The recurrent historical caution is threefold: to avoid sensationalizing children's deaths, to avoid minimizing adult responsibility by framing the events as mere tragedy, and to be precise about which claims are supported by multiple independent witnesses or by corroborating documents. Why do some details remain contested? Memory distortion under stress, the desire of some witnesses to minimize their own involvement, the political uses to which accounts were put during and after the war, and the simple destruction of documentary records all contribute. The Soviet handling of evidence introduced another layer of complexity. Early Soviet reports were shaped by wartime propaganda imperatives, later Soviet secrecy, and the archival practices of a state that did not always make its materials fully accessible to Western scholars. These factors combined to create persistent indefinido points in the micro-history of the bunker's events. From a historiographical standpoint, the Goebbels children's deaths raise broader questions about culpability, innocence, and memory. Children of dictators have appeared in many contexts, and historians ask similar questions across cases. To what extent can the children be treated as victims rather than accessories? How should public memory account for innocent dependents of guilty adults? The Goebbels case often becomes a test case precisely because the children were killed by, or at the behest of, their parents. That fact collapses the clean duality of victim and perpetrator and forces a deeper reflection on moral responsibility within families and political communities. Public memory and commemoration in post-war Germany and in the wider world treated the Goebbels family as part of the broader denouncement of National Socialism. There was no movement to memorialize or to sanctify the Goebbels children. Instead, their deaths are generally recounted within narratives that emphasize the criminality of the regime and the moral bankruptcy of its leaders. The absence of surviving Goebbels children meant there were fewer opportunities for personal testimony from descendants that could complicate or humanize the family story. Where relatives did speak publicly, again, notably Harold Quandt from Magda's previous marriage, their testimony often focused on business, survival, or later preservation of family privacy, rather than on attempts to recast or redeem the regime's actions. Ethically, historians and documentarians face challenges in telling this story. There is a legitimate human impulse to narrate the deaths of children with emotional immediacy. There is an equally strong obligation not to allow that emotion to humanize or excuse the perpetrators. The responsibility of an historian or narrator is therefore to present the facts as carefully as documentary evidence allows, to make clear which elements are agreed upon and which are disputed, and to avoid sensationalist elaboration. The scholarship around the bunker and its occupants reflects that careful approach. It sets the children's deaths within a context that condemns the ideology that produced such choices without reducing the victims to mere symbols. What, then, can be stated with a high degree of confidence? First, Joseph and Magda Goebbels' 6 children, young children living with them at the Reich Chancellery, died in the immediate collapse of the Third Reich around May 1, 1945. Second, testimony from multiple bunker witnesses supports the conclusion that they died after being sedated and that poison was involved. Third, the parents committed suicide in the same general time frame, leaving no immediate opportunity for legal or social reckonings involving those children. Fourth, the immediate handling of the bodies by occupying forces and the precise chain of custody in the chaotic hours that followed contain unresolved details and some contradictions among primary sources, so certain fine-grained facts remain indefinido. To be explicit about limits, the records do not provide an unbroken, contemporaneous chain of written evidence that answers every question historians or lay readers might have about who precisely administered which substance, the exact room in which each child died, or the minute-by-minute chronology in the final hours. Where memoirs and interviews diverge, historians must weigh credibility, consistency, and corroborating evidence. This is standard historical practice, not a failure of documentation unique to this case. Beyond the factual outline, the larger legacy concerns how societies remember or repudiate the families of those who carried out crimes. The Goebbels children's deaths are often invoked in debates about whether descendants should be held to account, how to treat the material inheritance of perpetrators, and how democratic societies can narrate their own culpable pasts without lapsing into simplification. The Goebbels case functions symbolically. The murder of children by a parent who had helped create an inhuman political order underscores both the personal and systemic corruption of the Nazi leadership. In closing, the factual response to the title question is direct and sobering. The Goebbels children who remained with their parents in the bunker were killed during the regime's final collapse. They did not survive into the post-war period. Much of the surrounding detail, who administered the fatal substances, the precise locations of the acts, and the exact disposition of the children's remains in the immediate aftermath, must be presented with caution. Key elements are supported by multiple first-person accounts and by the broader documentary record. Other elements remain indefinido and are the subject of scholarly debate. The story forces us to confront difficult truths about how fanaticism can obliterate the most basic familial duties, and how the lines between victim and affiliation are sometimes tragically blurred. For those who wish to go deeper, primary witnesses such as Traudl Junge and Rokas Misch provide indispensable first-hand perspectives. Post-war inquiries and the archival record, both Allied and Soviet, offer further documentary grounding. If you want recommended reading or archival sources, see the description below for a short bibliography and links to primary accounts and scholarly studies. For more on the final days of the Third Reich and how historians reconstruct contested episodes like this one, Watch our related video on the Führerbunker and the fall of Berlin, and check the description for vetted sources and transcripts.